This is the third and last of our videos for this week. And in this video, I'd like to talk more generally about Hitchcock's philosophy of filmmaking. He was particularly interested in how films were different from other art forms, what made movies distinctive. And in particular, his interest focused on editing, the way that films are put together in bits and pieces of sequences. He felt that editing was one of the characteristics that differentiated film from every other art form. His ideas about editing also gave rise to his distinction, a distinction that he made in many interviews between surprise and suspense that we'll talk about. And finally, he believed that editing was even more important than acting, which, as you can imagine, did not always please actors, but this is one of his deeply held beliefs. So we'll talk about that as well. The very beginning of Sabotage illustrates the use of what's called montage editing. Montage editing creates an effect by putting together very short pieces of film that don't on their own appear to have any connection. Let's see how this happens. And these frames come from a wonderful website called the Hitchcock Zone. The website has 1,000 frames from each of a number of Hitchcock's films. And one of the films that's featured is Sabotage. So if you're interested, you can really look at the film up close on this website. So in this sequence, we see an image of London lit up. Then we see a close-up of a light bulb. Then we see a voltmeter. Then we see the city in darkness. So we infer from the sequence of these shots that something has happened either at that plant or with that voltmeter to cause the city to be plunged into darkness. Then we see a group of men trying to figure out what happens. We see a close up of one of them with sand in his hands. Then together they say, sand, sabotage. And the next thing we see is an image of a man whom we haven't met in a hat with the Battersea Power Station behind him. So we, in our minds, put these individual shots together. We see the light, we see the darkness, we see the unknown gentleman figuring this out. And when they say sabotage, we see the person whom we then think must be responsible for it. So the sequence of images creates an event, the sabotage of a power plant, and connects it with a specific person. So right off the bat, we know certain things. We know a key event in the story, we know where the title comes from, and we've met the villain. We know who caused this sabotage because of the way this sequence is edited. Montage editing was developed in the 1920s by Soviet filmmakers, and it was used in some of the most famous films of that period, films that Hitchcock could have seen at the London Film Society. In addition to creating a structure for individual sequences, like the opening sequence that we just saw, editing can also create structure for the entire film. Sabotage is partly structured through repetition. In particular, you'll want to note the three different meals that take place in the film and that enable us to compare what has happened to the characters since the previous meal. The first meal in the upper left creates a sense of family togetherness. Winnie is preparing dinner as Mr. Verloc sits in his chair, and Stevie is trying to help, but he's very clumsy and ends up breaking a dish. For the second meal, Ted, still in his role as a grocer, takes Mrs. Verloc and Stevie to lunch at Simpson's, and we begin to see the change in their relationship. In the third meal at the bottom right, there's a very different emotional resonance, and the emotion of that scene is heightened by what we remember about the earlier meals. The third meal, shown here, is one of the most famous scenes in the film, in part because of the way it's edited. I won't show you a shot-by-shot breakdown because I don't want to reveal any spoilers, but when you watch it, think about how much the action and emotion are suggested by how the scene is cut together. The actress who played Mrs. Verloc, Sylvia Sidney, was an American, And the story is that she hated this scene until she saw it. She felt she wasn't acting, that she just stood there. But for Hitchcock, this scene represented the essence of cinema. Sylvia Sidney does not emote or cry or express her feelings in words. We infer what she is feeling and thinking because of the way bits of film are pieced together. We see her facial expressions intercut with the knife and shots of her husband, and we know what is on her mind. So she felt that she did very little acting. And Hitchcock's view was really, you don't need actors. You need carefully assembled bits of film. And by putting them together, the audience will infer the actor's emotions. I thought I'd share with you a statement he made about montage and editing in a very famous essay that was published the year Sabotage came out called Direction. He said, "What I like to do always is to photograph just the little bits of a scene that I really need for building up a visual sequence. I want to put my film together on screen, not simply to photograph something that has been put together already in the form of a long piece of stage acting." So he equates dramatic acting with being on stage. But what makes film distinctive is that you can take little bits and pieces, even of someone's face or an object, and edit them together to create the emotion. You don't actually need a performer to perform the emotion. That was his view. The other famous scene in the film involved Mrs. Verloc's brother, Stevie. In the novel, Stevie is an odd character who spends a lot of time scribbling circles and gets very upset when he overhears the anarchists plotting. In the film, Stevie is sweet and engaging. We like him. We understand his bumbliness and his fumbling, and we appreciate Mrs. Verloc's love for him. Those feelings of affection set us up for a key scene in the film that Hitchcock felt illustrated the difference between surprise and suspense. This is how he explained it. He said that if a film creates a feeling of surprise, something happens that you don't expect. And so you might be momentarily shocked or stunned, but it's a momentary reaction. Now, by contrast, he said, suspense is when you're on the edge of your seat. Suspense is when you know something might happen, but you're not sure if it's going to happen. And so you're waiting and waiting and waiting. And this is exactly what happens in one of the most famous and longest sequences of the film as Stevie makes his way across London during the Lord Mayor's parade. This scene will keep you on the edge of your seat, and we'll talk about it when we see each other for our live event. Thank you.